Yes, so good morning. What a conversation. So I'm going to come at this a little bit differently. It might even be a different perspective than most of you have ever heard before. I think the complex question, talking about the speed of adoption and the implications to the system, to the patient, is a real complex question. I think that'll go on. My piece is a little bit different than that. So I want to come at this problem that we've got in healthcare, we'll call it, differently in a way that helps us change how we look at the problem and maybe look at healthcare and the investment in healthcare as a solution. So one of the things that I'm most passionate about, and certainly that passion is growing, is the idea of attracting major amounts of medical device research and development dollars to Canada. I believe it's important because I believe that will enable our furtherment of our clinical knowledge, and I think it'll also enable our care innovation, and it'll drive economic growth in this country. So over the next 10 to 15 minutes while I've got the podium, I'm going to take you through an example of who we are as Canadians, our system, how it's looked at by industry when we're deciding on factors of where to invest our valuable clinical trial dollars. I'll rely on a research paper that was done recently that helps us gain some insight into how these decisions are being made. So if we as Canadians are perplexed and confused that maybe we believe that we should be getting more access to some of these clinical trials, maybe we can provide some insight based on this paper that I'll share with you and some of the results of that paper. And then I'll close by changing, I believe, how you might be looking at investments in healthcare. I'm going to share an example. The example's from Japan. And I can tell you that Japan looked at the challenge of healthcare and the crippling spend of growing healthcare costs very differently. In fact, what they did is they chose to invest against that scenario. And when they invested against that scenario, what they found is not only did they address the patient needs, they attracted huge amounts of clinical research investment, created a cluster, and drove massive amounts of contribution to their GDP. So they solved it all. So instead of being healthcare the problem, it was healthcare the solution. So I want to share that particular perspective with you today. So the title of my talk is Turning Healthcare into an Economic Engine, which is a funny audience, I guess, to be presenting this to. Well, we're going to go with it. So as we take a look at Canadian healthcare, and we're often criticized, or we do criticize our system. It's described as one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest problems that we face as Canadians, as it uses up more and more of our valuable GDP dollars. And as a result, government payers, in reaction to these factors, these critical factors, have treated healthcare like a cost center. For the past 2 decades, they've approached managing the growth of our care by cutting and rationing, cutting inputs into care, rationing patient access to care. That's how they've managed it. And I believe there's enough data out there, there's enough data points out there to suggest that that's just not working anymore. In fact, after the past 2 decades of trying to shrink ourselves into greatness, I believe we're at a crossroads that's going to require some different thinking, and we've essentially got a couple decisions to make. One of them is expressed in the cartoon. We can either continue status quo and play it safe, and we can slowly decline into obsolescence. The other option is we can approach it differently. We can approach it with the needs of all the various stakeholders, and we can approach this in a way that instead of positioning not to lose, which is what we've been doing, cutting and rationing, we can position the Canadian health system and all the stakeholders in it to win. So I want to share with you a little bit of data. This is recent data, come from the Naylor report. The Naylor report was a federally commissioned report, and it was designed to determine what's happened to Canada's research industry, namely the basic and applied science industry. We used to be leaders in this industry. This study came out, concluded that Canada is no longer a destination for basic and applied research. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the points that was cited to support the fact that we're no longer a sought-after destination for basic and applied research is the fact that Canada, when we relate Canada to the spend of other small countries, we spend less, we invest less in basic and applied research, and therefore we get less. And so to take this example closer to home and in a way that you might better understand, you may have noticed in your cath labs, in your centers, that medical device investments in research and development and such is down. It's down. It's being scaled down versus prior years. And even the modest levels of prior years, it's down. And in my mind, that's not right. In my mind, I think we deserve more. I believe that too few Canadian centers are getting access and opportunities to lead major international clinical trials and participate in those trials. Too few centers are getting access to strategic contract opportunities, and far, far too few Canadian centers are attracting major grants and academic chairs to support important research. So that said, I want to take a look at who Canada is. And we're going to ask the question at the back end of this, the why. Why are we in the position we're in? So we've got world-renowned clinical investigators, many of you and your colleagues in this room today, world-class institutions. We've got brand-recognized, well-sought-after, and well-respected institutions in this country. And we've got a proven legacy of innovation. Canada, over the past 100 years, has been a major leader in healthcare innovation. In fact, the number of medical firsts for a small country of 35 million is astonishing. So the question becomes, why are we having a problem attracting more than just a modest amount of clinical trial activity in this country? Well, to get at the answer, I'm going to go do some research. I'm going to share some research with you. And so this research comes from the British Medical Journal. And it's as a result of an event in Europe. In fact, what happened in Europe a few years back is that Europe's access to clinical trial activity dropped by more than 25% between the years 2007 and 2011. Dropped 25%. So the Europeans commissioned a big study, a massive study, 485 life sciences and clinical research firm executives in 34 countries. So big study. And they were trying to determine what makes a desirable clinical site. What factors go into deciding? And the results were published in 2013 in this journal. And to no one's surprise, really, the first two are pretty obvious. The number one criteria that drove clinical site selection when decided by health executives was the strength of the investigators, the quality of the investigators, the reputation of the investigators. Number two, and these are all judged out of 100 points, and you can see 29 in the first category, 28 in the second category, strong sites, so reputable sites, strong brand recognition, et cetera. And the third one might surprise some people. The third factor deciding where clinical trial investments are made was something called environmental or market factors. Environmental or market factors are defined as things like regulatory restrictions and framework, speed of innovation, the cost and price at which those products go into your market. Those types of factors, known as market factors, became the third most important deciding factor in clinical research allocation. And the really interesting thing about this is how those factors play among each other. 20 years ago, Canada had a major advantage in the area of clinical investigators, quality clinical investigators in sites. In the past 20 years, many countries have put investments against those clinical investigators, against the sites, to bring them up and close that gap between them and Canada and the other leaders. And now, today, companies, industry has a lot of choice. Industry can go almost anywhere in the world to major countries, major developed countries, and find reputable investigators, and they can find strong clinical programs to invest in. And the funny thing about that is those two top criteria ended knotting up and being the ticket to the game. And by default, the deciding factor became factor number 3, the attractiveness of your market. So this is not good news for Canada. So while other countries were gearing up their resources to close that gap and become a reputable clinical trial site, Canada was actually weakening its market environment. So today, Canada has a relatively restrictive regulatory environment. We're slow to approve clinical trials, slower than comparative countries. We're slower to approve commercial licenses, slower than comparative countries. We have some of the lowest prices in the world, and you would know that in the area that you're in, stents and balloons, about the lowest prices in the world. And we adopt slow. So compared to other countries, other developed countries, Canada adopts innovation very slowly. So when you compound these factors, Canada is a very unattractive, uncompetitive environment for clinical sites. Now, not to depress everyone, I do want to come at it this way as well, because I think it's a question for the room. Does the room believe that the market factors of a country, of this country, are a constant that we can't control, or are the market factors a variable that we can affect? And I'm going to again go to another case study. This case study is a case study from Japan. I mentioned Japan earlier on. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But the reality of this case study is that Shinzo Ibe, through Ebenomics, back in 2013, it was a strategy to kickstart his economy. And he decided that he'd bring two strategies together. The idea was to solve an aging population problem through the investment of regenerative medicine, and at the same time use that strategy to fuel economic growth in the country. And so what he did is as important as what he didn't do. What he did was he eased up the regulatory restraints in Japan. What he didn't do is he didn't make extra investments in the clinical investigators or in the academic centers. All he did was lower the hurdles for companies coming into Japan, doing their clinical research in the area of regenerative medicine, and he gave them access to the Japanese market, significant earlier access, 3.5 years versus 10 years, which is pretty significant. So you can imagine what happened. He attracted global regenerative medicine companies. They all flocked to Japan. He created a cluster, and Japan went from doing 6 clinical sites, trial sites in 2012, to almost 40 major international clinical trials in 2016. And as a result of this cluster, he created also this huge economic engine through this activity. This cluster that he's created is now valued at $30 billion, or will be valued at $30 billion in the next 10 to 15 years. So he's created what was a major problem, and he's turned it into a solution for his patients and a major economic driver. Now, so what Japan did was not unique. Other countries are doing it. I don't want to go into all this, but I do want to let everybody know that these are countries we're competing with. They've actively looked at regulatory reform to drive economic activity through trials. Germany's been doing the same thing for years. Sweden's been doing that. And one not on this chart is we've heard Trump talking about the United States. He's vowed to streamline the FDA so that he can bring new innovations quicker, attract more clinical trial work, and that's done precisely to bring business back to the United States and drive the economic engine of the United States. So this is what we're competing with. And as I get near to the end of my time and my talk, I want to remind everybody that we can do and we can employ some of these strategies. It's going to be up to all of us as stakeholders in the ecosystem as which ones make most sense for us. I would say that if we wanted to take that first step, it'd be fantastic to find a way to focus more on patient outcomes, which we're doing now, find a way to put our shoulders against taking the friction out of our regulatory environment, which will make us more attractive for clinical investments, and then find a way to fund the adoption of innovation, which is some of the strategies that both Germany and Australia are using highly effectively to draw in massive amounts of clinical investments. So that's essentially my talk. I hope that I provided you with a different perspective. I'm hoping that this perspective will form part of the narrative in the future conversations that we have when we're talking about taking Canada, as I mentioned earlier, from not winning to winning. And the last thing I'll stress is that it's really, really important that we also change the way that Canada and the healthcare system is managed. We need to move that away from being treated like a cost center, because the terrible thing about that is that we're underutilizing the clinical investigators and innovation in this room. It's one of our greatest med treasures in this country, and it's clearly being underutilized in my mind. Thank you for your time.